Hi everybody, my name is Christopher Warner, as you probably already know, and welcome to the Connecting the Dots 2020 conference. I am delighted to be a part of this, and I hope that you've been enjoying some of the other presenters so far, taking in some of the exhibitors and doing some of the networking events, and really enjoying the conference. I know that we probably all wanted to do this live and in person, but I do appreciate that April and Jacqueline and the rest of the team were able to keep this conference alive and take it virtual, and that we're able to do this now. One of the reasons that I really wanted to be a part of this, and I was really hoping to be in Toronto for the conference, is because I wanted to do the CN Tower Edge Walk again. And I say again because I did it back in 2014 and I loved it. It was so much fun. People asked me after I did it, they said, well, weren't you nervous? Weren't you scared? Yes, I was, because I am a guy who has a fear of heights, believe it or not. But I'm also a guy with vision loss. And I thought, you know what? You can't be afraid of what you can't see, right? Well, maybe. Anyway, the other reason I wanted to do the CN Tower Edge Walk, and in fact, if you're in Toronto and you're watching this right now and you've been thinking about it, you might want to do it at this time, because if you think about it, the CN Tower Edge Walk is the living embodiment of physical distancing, because you are more than 1,000 feet from anybody at ground level. So that is kind of physical distancing to the extreme for this for that event. So if you get a chance to take it in, I highly recommend it. The view is spectacular, the experience is amazing, and it's a lot of fun. And I will get back to Toronto and I will get to do it someday, just not right now. But what I am going to talk to you about today, I'm going to connect the dots for you here on my presentation today and what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory and how I got here and what brought me to this stage. I'm also going to share with you some employment-related stories that I've had as a person with vision loss. And finally, I'm going to wrap it up talking about things that I've been able to accomplish, not only in spite of my vision loss, but also because of my vision loss. It has actually brought me opportunities that I never knew would exist. So I'm going to get into that in a minute. But first, I want to start by asking you a question, and feel free to drop an answer in the chat. What I want to ask you is, have you ever had a dream that was all you could think about? It would just, you ate, slept, dreamt about it, it was all consuming for you. I was that boy. I had that dream. When I was 12 years old, I was living in a little town in northwest Ontario, just outside of Dryden, Ontario, which Dryden itself is not a very big place, but I was living 5 miles out of the town in another little community, and it was a very small little place. And while I was living out there, being a 12-year-old boy, I liked to watch television, but living out there, we had 2 channels. You had CBC and you had CBC Radio-Canada. Unless you had one of those big satellite dishes in your front yard, those big 6-foot wide things that they used to have, then you could probably get in a few more channels, but those things were a little bit out of my parents' price range, so 2 channels it was. And the other thing that was working against me while I was living outside of that little town, or outside that little community outside of Dryden, was the phone line. Back in those days, we were on what was known as a party line. Now, for the uninitiated, or if you've never experienced it, a party line might sound like a lot of fun. But I am here to tell you it is the exact opposite of fun when it comes to being on the phone. A party line, for those of you who've never experienced it, has multiple houses on one phone line. And each house is assigned a ringtone that they have to listen for to know when it's their turn to pick up the phone, when that call's for them. And it's not the kind of fun ringtones that you can have on your phone these days. This was very rudimentary ringtones that, you know, the first house on the line might have 2 long rings, the next house in line might have a long and a short ring, and then the third house might have 2 short rings that they had to listen for to know when that incoming call was for them. And then when you wanted to make an outbound call, you had to pick up the phone, listen, and if somebody was on the phone, you had to wait until they were done before you were able to make a phone call. And let me tell you, when I was living in that little house outside of Dryden, the neighbor that was on our party line, she was very, very chatty. And so talking on the phone at length, she already had it monopolized, so that was really not going to be an option either. So with those two things limited, television limited, phone limited to talk to my friends, the next source of entertainment that I had as a 12-year-old boy was radio. And I took that in as much as I could. Not only was I listening to the music all the time because, you know, I was a teenager or a preteen, listening to all the music that was out then, I was also listening to the radio itself. I was listening to the commercials, I was listening to the DJs, and I thought, wow, those guys are having so much fun. That seems like such a cool thing to do. And then I lived in that town for a year and a half before my family moved to Winnipeg. Winnipeg, for, again, at that time, 13-year-old me, Winnipeg was just a mecca for radio and television as far as I was concerned, because there was so many more radio stations and they had local TV stations. So I was taking in all of this different media, listening to the different stations, checking them all out, finding the different music types that I liked, and also listening to the different personalities, because every station had all these DJs on there, all with their own personalities, and it seemed like so much fun that just, the passion in me grew. And while I was in junior high school, the guidance counselor caught on to my love of broadcasting, probably because I helped organize. I was in a career club in junior high school, and I helped organize a couple of tours, one to a local radio station and one to a local TV station, to check things out. It was very selfishly for me because I wanted to see these things, but I knew that my classmates would find it pretty cool too. And the guidance counselor was very supportive, and she helped make those things happen. When it was time to leave junior high school and to pick a high school, the guidance counselor did something for me that I will absolutely never forget. She arranged for me to go to a different school out of my school division, to a vocational school in another part of Winnipeg that had a radio and TV station in its programmed offerings. And so this was actually a program that you could take and study, was radio and television broadcasting in the high school. So she arranged for me to be able to go there, and that's where I went for my 3 years of high school. And so to this day, Miss Whitaker, wherever you are, thank you so much. You just made that dream come true. Now, I did very well at that program. I excelled in all 3 years. I achieved the top student award, and I thought I was really on my way, and I was still all consumed by this dream. The other thing that I had to do out of high school is I started making calls to the operations manager of what was then CKND TV. It's now Global Winnipeg. And back in those days, they didn't have voicemail. You talked to the receptionist put you through. If the person wasn't answering, you'd go back to reception, and she would write a note saying, you know, so-and-so called for you, on a little pink notepad saying message for you. I called that station every week, trying to talk to the operations manager and trying to find out if he had a spot for me, because I really wanted to work in television. Finally, after a year of making those calls, I got a call back from the program manager at CKND TV. She said she'd gotten my name from the operations manager and she wanted to talk to me because she had a 3-month contract position that she wanted to know if I would be interested in taking. Now, at the time, I was working for the University of Manitoba in their audiovisual department. I was full-time, permanent, making pretty good money for a 17-year-old kid, and you know, had it pretty good, but I still wanted to be in broadcast. So when I got this opportunity and she called and said, you know, I've got this 3-month job, do you want to take it? Yes, please. When? You know, can we do it now? Yes, I did. I took that job. Not only was I risking my full-time permanent spot because I was now taking a 3-month contract, I also took a 50% pay cut to go work for CKND. But luck was on my side. And just 2 weeks before that contract was supposed to end, the person I was replacing came in. She told her boss that she was moving to Ottawa with her husband and she was leaving. So they turned to me and they said, you want the job? And so that 3-month contract turned into nearly 16 years with Global TV, working at Winnipeg, then Regina, and also finally in Toronto. Until 2005, when everything changed. Now I need to take you back a little bit further in my history and explain that I have a condition called hydrocephalus, or water on the brain. And I have a shunt that drains fluid from around my head down to another part of my body where the body can absorb it better. And right now it's draining to a little pocket near my right lung. That's where the shunt's been for the last few years. I have had this shunt since I was 3 months old, and I've had 15 revisions on it in my lifetime. The revision that I had in 2005 did not go according to plan. I had to go in for emergency surgery, and while I was in there, and they had to replace the shunt because it had blocked pretty hard, they did the revision, and after the surgery, I didn't wake up, and I was not as responsive as I should have been, or as I normally was after most of my shunt revisions. So my spouse noticed that, the doctors noticed it, so they did more tests, and they found that the shunt that they put in actually blocked. There was a little blood clot in it, and they had to go back in, and they had to revise the shunt a second time. Coming out of that second shunt revision, that's when we really learned that I had a big problem. My spouse came to see me after that surgery, and she noticed while I was talking to her that I was not looking at her when we were talking. And so she did a little test with me. She'd seen this neurosurgeon do this test. She said, "How many fingers am I holding up?" And I said, "Well, I can't see your fingers, but I think I see your hand." And that's when we learned that I now had a vision impairment. The neurosurgeon and the other doctors, he got a neuro-ophthalmologist involved, and they did some investigating. And what they learned was that the pressure of the fluid around my brain had squeezed the blood vessels that feed the occipital lobe of my brain and cut the blood supply to that part of the brain. And the occipital lobe is the part that processes eyesight. So it was basically leaving me blind, or legally blind anyway. And back in those days, actually, all I was seeing was light and shadows. So by the definitions of sight loss, I was actually classed as light perception. The doctor did tell me, however, that because the pressure was relieved, the blood was starting to flow through those blood vessels again, and I would probably get some of my sight back, but he couldn't tell me how much. He said, "We just have to wait and see." And so I went home, and I went on to short-term disability, and then subsequently on to long-term disability. Now, in all the years that I'd been working for Global, I mean, I'd definitely been using the part of my benefits plan for prescriptions and for dentists and that sort of thing, but I'd never really paid much attention to the part of my benefits for short-term and long-term disability until that point. What I learned from my now vision loss and waiting to see what I'd recover, what I learned was that my short-term disability kicked in automatically, and it covered 100% of my wages minus deductions, and I was able to continue along without any interruption in my pay. That was awesome. To get on to long-term disability after 3 months, I needed the doctor to fill out some paperwork, which he did, and so he certified that yes, I was vision impaired, and I was probably going to be off work for at least a year, subject to him following up to check and see how things were going to go. So I went on to long-term disability, and what I learned about the long-term disability, again through my benefits plan, was that even though it was only covering 70% of my wages, because I was paying the premiums as part of the deductions on my payroll, that 70% was actually tax-free. So while I was on long-term disability, I was actually making a slightly bit more money than I had been when I was working in my job. Let me tell you, that was such a huge relief, because it just meant one less thing to worry about while I was trying to recover and waiting to see what I would recover of my vision. So I was really, really thankful for that. And just when it seemed that things were good and we were just going to wait and see how things were recovering and how I was doing, 5 months into my recovery, remember the doctor said we were going to wait a year and see what was going to happen. 5 months into my recovery, a Monday in March, was actually a Tuesday in March, sorry, was a very, very bad day. 2 things happened. One, on the Monday night, we got a call. My wife and I both worked for Global TV at the time. So we got a call from our manager, and he said there was going to be a really big staff meeting tomorrow morning, and he wanted us both to be there. And I said, well, wait a minute, I'm on disability. Like, do you really want me at the staff meeting? And he said, yeah, you're part of the staff. I really think you should be there. I said, okay, I'll be there. Just before his phone call, we had been watching a show on the Business Channel, and on that show that we were watching, one of the segments, they were talking about how to know you were getting laid off. And in the segment, the interview guest said, if you are called into a staff meeting and you're called into a meeting with your boss and there is an HR person either in the meeting or in the room adjacent to your meeting, your days with that company are probably coming to an end. And having watched that program and then received the boss's phone call, my wife and I were both kind of joking about it and thought, oh wow, well, I guess we'll see what happens tomorrow, won't we? The next morning, we went to that meeting, and I can't see faces very well. I saw them even more poorly back then. So I wasn't able to look around and see who was there. I only picked things up by people's voices. But my wife looked around the room, and she saw the HR person who had been helping me with my benefits in the back of the room. And she said, oh, Megan's there. And at that point, we both knew that a big change was coming. Sure enough, when they convened the meeting, they told us that our entire department was being laid off, and all of our jobs and the work was moving to Calgary, where the Calgary Global TV station was going to run the entire operation for the whole country. And they said there would be some jobs in Calgary that we'd be welcome to apply for, but they said the 40 of us in that room at that moment were all losing our jobs. Now, it was a working layoff. They told us this happened in March, and they told us that this would happen at the end of August. So it was a working layoff, and then people would be paid out when it was over. I was still on disability, so they told me that I would remain on disability until it came to an end, and then I'd get laid off like everybody else. How's that for something to look forward to? One of the things that they did for us as part of that layoff notice was the team at Global, they set us up with a career coach to talk to about what we might be able to do with our skills and where we might want to go from that layoff. And even though I was still on disability, I knew that I'd have to go back at work at some point because, like I said, I was feeling good in every other way except my eyesight, so I wanted to get back to work. And so I took the opportunity to talk to the career coach. And I asked him, you know, now that I'm a guy with sight loss, how am I going to disclose this? Because that's a big question for anybody with a disability. And here I was new to this. So of course it was a question that was burning for me. He didn't have an answer. That career coach said he couldn't help me. He didn't know how or when to disclose it. That was not helpful. So I talked to, they had another career coach that they brought in. And I asked him the same question. I said, how or when should I disclose this? And he gave me two really awesome pieces of advice while we were talking. One to do with disclosure and one just general piece of advice that I never forgot, and I'm going to share with you. The first thing he told me, he said, when you're looking for jobs, he said, try to just approach people from an information interview standpoint. He said, because people who ask for information get jobs. People who ask for jobs get information. And that advice stuck with me, and I thought, wow, that is so powerful. I loved that. The other thing he told me regarding disclosure, he said, tell them about your sight loss at an appropriate time in the interview, but he said also follow it up with your solutions to how you're going to get the job done. Tell them about the tools you're going to need and tell them how you're going to get it done. And for me, in that case, at that time in my life, I was using ZoomText software on my computer. I was using a large print keyboard and a CCTV to read printed material, things that I still use to this day. So he said, if you tell them about your site and then you tell them about those things, you know, you're gonna present them with the problem, but you're also gonna present them with the solution immediately after, and you're not gonna leave it up to them to figure out how to accommodate you, because you're going to tell them how to do it. And that was the best advice he ever could have given me. So Stephen, wherever you are, thank you so much for that advice, because it has paid off in spades. After my layoff notice, and like I said, I wanted to get back to work, and I wasn't waiting. And I also wasn't waiting for the disability to be up. I was so tired of being on disability, and I wanted to get out and work again. So the very first place that I worked after my sight loss was for VoicePrint Canada, what is now AMI Audio. I joined them as a studio producer, and that was an awesome place for me to be, because as a newly vision impaired person, not only was I working at a place whose mandate it was to provide service to vision impaired people, there were other vision impaired people on staff there, and that gave me an opportunity to interact with them and talk with them and ask them questions about things I didn't know yet about my vision impairment or how to be vision impaired. I'll give you one example. When you're riding the buses and the trains in Toronto, you have to have that second bus pass that the TTC does through the CNIB. When I was going into some of the stations that didn't have a ticket taker there, I didn't know how to get through the turnstile. So I asked them, I said, well, how do I get through the turnstile when there's nobody there? And they said, oh, well, that card that you get from CNIB and through TTC, if you swipe it in the card reader, it unlocks the turnstile. I'm like, oh, that's amazing. Oh my gosh. Okay, so problem solved. See, this is why that was such an awesome experience for me, because those guys were there for me and they were such a fantastic resource. So Bill, Kelly, Jerry, Tony, all of you guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I worked for VoicePrint for a little over 2 years. But by then I needed a different opportunity and I needed to take on a different adventure. And while I had been on disability, I started taking the Canadian Securities course for the financial services industry. And I also took a couple other financial industry courses, and I thought, you know what? I want to go off and try this. And so this is where I'm gonna lead in. I'm gonna actually share with you some of my interview adventures that I've had since the time I lost my sight and since I left VoicePrint. Because VoicePrint, like I said, being that was a place that catered to vision impaired people, it seemed like a really good place to work. But now I was trying to get work in the outside world. And so what I'm going to share with you is I'm going to call the good, the great, and the ugly when it came to job interview experiences. First, I want to start with the great. About 3 years after my sight loss, I applied to TD Waterhouse, the discount brokerage arm of TD Bank Financial Group. And in that interview, I think I was feeling, when I got the interview, I was in a very much a sort of blurted out sort of a mood that day when it came to my disclosure. I told them about my sight loss very early on. I put my 6x magnifier down on the table in front of us, and I left it there for the duration of the interview. Not that it really became a focus of the conversation, but I just kind of left it there as a presence in the room. Not only did I get hired for the job, a week before I was to start, one of the managers reached out to me and he said, I'd like you to come in and meet with me because I want to talk about the accommodations you're going to need in order to be able to do this job. So I went in and I met with him and told him about Zoom text, and I told him about the large letter keyboard, and I told him about the CCTV, like I had talked about. He, expecting some sort of pushback, I was expecting some pushback from him. And so I thought, you know what, I said to him, if you can't get the Zoom text software, there's a thing I can do to magnify the screen or maybe enlarge the print. I said, if you can't get the CCTV, I can use my handheld magnifier. And he stopped me. And he said, no, no, no. Tell me what you need and we'll make it happen. And 1 week later, true to his word, on my first day at work, everything was there and in place and ready to go. That was phenomenal. That was so awesome. And part of the reason that was so awesome was because prior to that, I had a different job interview with another company where I talked about needing a CCTV, and they said, well, do you have one at home? And I said, yes. And they said, well, could you bring it to work with you every day? This thing weighs 60 pounds. You want me to carry it back and forth to work every day? No. Although I think about it now, and had I said yes, think of the muscles I would have had. Holy smokes. But no, I did not take my CCTV to work with me every day. But that experience with TD Waterhouse, that was what I call the phenomenal job interview experience. The bad one, I'm going to share the bad one. The bad one, about a year after I had released my book, and there's a little spoiler alert for you. I'm going to talk about my book in a few minutes. But about a year after I had released my book, I was looking for, I was going in for this interview at a place, and it was an office admin type role. It was an accounting type role, because I had an educational background in accounting as well. And so I went in for the interview, and I met the interviewer, and I told him that I had written a book. And that just got our conversation off to a great start, because he was like, oh, my wife is in publishing. And he told me about his wife being in publishing, and we talked a little bit about that, and it got our conversation off to a really great start. And we went into the interview room, we sat down, and he sat across from me, and I could see my resume. It was a piece of paper as far as I'm concerned, but I knew it was my resume. And I could see that he had a bunch of markings on it, probably about things he wanted to ask me about or things he wanted to talk to me about. But before we got there, he asked me, he said, well, by the way, he said, what was your book about? And I told him, I said, well, my book was about my sight loss, because it was sudden and unexpected. And so I wrote about the experience and about recovering from it. And that stopped the interview cold. His focus shifted at that point. And he was no longer talking about the job interview or the job or anything. He said, the one thing he said to me, he said, well, this job is very computer-based. How are you going to do this? And I said, well, with a Zoom text software and a large letter keyboard and a CCTV unit for reading printed material, right? I gave him the solutions, just as I had talked about, correct? Yeah, you believe it or not, no, that wasn't how it worked out. Telling him about my accommodation needs shifted his focus from talking about the job and how I could do the job with those accommodations to who was going to pay for it. That was all he could focus on. And, I could have told him about the program that we have here in Alberta that helps employers pay for devices for people. But I decided, you know what? At that point in my head, I was losing interest in the interview as well. I saw his change in tone. I saw his shift, and I thought, you know what? I don't want to work here. So the interview wrapped up. We left it on a very cordial tone, and he said, you know what? You'll know the result in a week. I never heard from him. But you know what? It's one thing that I decided very early on in my life was that if somebody didn't want to hire me, that was their loss, not mine. And I don't say that to be arrogant. I say it because I found it to be very freeing to be able to say, I'll find another place to apply for. I will find another place to find work. I don't need that. And it allowed me to release that and not take it so hard. And while I'm on that subject, I actually want to share a couple other things with you about some of the things that I've done on my resume to get attention or to bring this to people's attention. And one of the first things I'll tell you is that on my resume, I actually do give a hint to employers about my sight loss. Because when I'm on my resume where I list my computer skills, I list Zoom Text as one of the computer programs that I'm very good at or very good with. And that's kind of a hint to see what happens. The other thing that I do, that I've done on my resume in the past, is I've put things on there that kind of get attention. Way back when before I started working for VoicePrint, but after I'd received the layoff notice from Global TV, I had another interview where, because I was taking the securities course at the time, I put that as one of the things on my resume, even though it had nothing to do with the job I was applying for at that moment. I put it on there as one of the things that I was currently working on. And the hiring manager who was interviewing me, he saw that, and he knew about the Canadian Securities course. He knew what it was, and he said that he knew that it was a really tough course. So it became a great conversation piece to propel the interview and make it just add more to it and make it more conversational and not just a peppering of questions. The other thing that I'm going to share with you, so it's like I said, I shared with you the best employment story that I've had, or interview story I've had. I've also shared with you the worst one. Now I'm going to share what I call a really good one, and that was my time when I applied for my first job that I got at CNIB. When I went in for the interview, I met with the hiring manager at the reception desk, and as we were walking down the hall to the interview room where we were gonna talk, she made a comment, and she said, I noticed on your resume that your email address is, she says, it's very unique. And my email address, just to catch you up, my email address is christopher@lifesnotover.ca, which is another spoiler alert I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But she said, that's a very unique email address. And she says, I bet there's a story behind that. And I said, yeah, there really is. And you're probably going to learn about it when we sit down in the interview. When we got into that interview and we sat down, she asked me, she looked at my resume and she said, there's a number of years of financial services experience on here. She said, what do you want with a job at CNIB? And I said, for two reasons. One, because I'm a guy with vision loss and I get it. This was one of the places where I thought actually sharing my vision loss that openly was going to be an asset. And it turned out to be. I said, the second reason that I want this job, in addition to my sight loss, I said, because I rock at customer service. Was that a little bit arrogant of me? Maybe. But you know what? I was feeling pretty good. And like I said, I have that mindset where if I don't get this job, I can move on. But it actually worked out really well in my favor, because that job, that first job with CNIB, became the fastest callback I've ever had. I got called back and offered the job within 20 minutes of the interview. I wasn't even home yet. So that one, I call that a win, not only because the resume got attention, but also because the attitude that I was able to share and the disclosure, everything worked, everything was in alignment, and everything was perfect. Now, I've shared with you a couple of times already, I've given you a couple of spoiler alerts about my book and about my email address. And you might have also noticed my t-shirt. For those of you who can't read my t-shirt, I'm wearing a blue t-shirt with white print that says, I'm on this planet for fun. And underneath it is my website, www.lifesnotover.ca. When I was recovering from my sight loss, one of the things that my spouse suggested to me very early on in my sight loss journey was she said, why don't you start writing this down as a journal? Why don't you keep notes about your experiences, your progress, what you're feeling, all of that kind of stuff, and just write all of that stuff out. She said, it's something to do. And so back in those early days, I didn't have Zoom text yet. So she set me up on an MS Word document at 72-point font. Now, if none of you have ever typed at 72-point font, I encourage you to go and try it on your own computer and just see exactly what that looks like and see how much you see on the screen at any one time. It's not much, let me tell you. But that's what I needed at the time. That was the smallest print size I could read comfortably. So that's what I was doing. And I was keeping my notes and I was doing that sort of thing. And about 3 years into doing that, I mentioned to a couple people that I was keeping this journal, and a couple of them said to me, I'd really like to read that someday. And I thought, wow, okay, well, maybe I've got something here. And I started to think about it a little bit more seriously, about someday turning it into a book. Now, from the time that I was going to turn it into a book, I knew that I was always going to self-publish the book, because probably about 2 years before my sight loss, I had been watching an interview with Bob Young, the owner of the Hamilton Tiger Cat football team. He was talking about how he was becoming the new owner of the Ticats at that time. And in that interview, he mentioned that he was going to start up a company called Lulu that helped people self-publish books. And I thought, that's the way I'm going to go. So when I decided in about 2008 or 9 that I was going to start turning my journal into something a little more like a book and a memoir, I knew I was going to self-publish it right from the get-go. One of the other things I had to do at that time, when I had sort of written everything that I needed to write, I shared it with a friend of mine who had been helping me along the way, and she read through it all, and she said, you know, I love your story. She said, you know, I like your story, but she says, I'm too close to it. I can't give you the objective input that you need to turn this into something really good. She said, what you need is a professional editor. I didn't know where to find an editor or how to find an editor, but I knew a couple people who'd written books, so I reached out to them and I said, how did you find an editor? And the one lady got back to me and she said that she'd been out of it too long. The people, the connections she had, they were all gone. She didn't have any of that anymore. So I reached out completely on a whim to David Chilton from the Dragon's Den. He used to be a part of the Dragon's Den, and he's also the author of The Wealthy Barber. I knew that he had self-published The Wealthy Barber, and I didn't know Mr. Chilton. I never met him, didn't know anybody who could help connect me to him, but I did some online searching and I found an email address for him, and I wrote to him and I said, how did you find an editor for your book? He responded back to my email, and he didn't offer me any advice. He asked for my phone number. And an hour after sending him an email with my phone number, he got back to me, called me, and we talked for about 20 minutes, and he gave me some fantastic advice. And he also gave me the name of a lady that I could contact to be an editor. I did reach out to her, and she wasn't getting back to me in any sort of timely fashion. So the other thing I did while I was waiting is I reached out to, I was doing some more online searching, and I found an organization called editors.ca, or a website called editors.ca, which is a collection of freelance editors and writers and such who can help you out. So I wrote to them and I said, I've written this book and I need an editor and I want somebody Calgary-based. Can you help me out? Within a day of sending them that email, I got a reply back saying, yeah, we're going to fish this out to our Calgary Twig, as they called it. And again, in less than a day of them sending out that email, I had 6 replies from people who wanted to be my editor. I narrowed that down to 3. I spoke to each of the 3 that I was interested in, and from there I narrowed it down to the one lady that I wanted to work with. When we agreed to work together, I gave her my full manuscript, and she gave me back, as a way of sort of an opening salvo to working on it, she gave me a 6-page report on my book, or my manuscript. And the first 2 pages were very complimentary. She said, you know, he writes well, I like the concept, the guy can spell. I thought, great. The next 4 pages, she ripped it apart. Oh my gosh. I read the 4 pages of everything that she thought was wrong with it, and I thought, oh my God, she hates it. How is this ever going to work? So I took a deep breath. Sitting at my computer, I took a deep breath after reading her email. And I wrote back to her and I said, fine, let's fix it. And we took 6 months of working on the book, and we turned it into what is now the memoir, Life's Not Over, It Just Looks Different. It is available on many different sources on the internet, through Amazon and whatnot. And that book has now, since being released in 2016, that book has sold in 6 different countries around the world. And that's not because I've been to those countries. That is the power of the internet, and that is the power of Facebook ads and what those were able to do for me. After writing that book, what I learned from that was that I really liked the process. I loved the process of, writing it, working with the editor, doing all of that stuff, and even the self-publishing thing and the marketing and all of that. I loved the whole process. And I thought, you know what, if I ever get a chance, I want to do this again. But I want the right opportunity. A few years later, in my day job, now my job at CNIB has changed. I started out working in the shop, in the CNIB shop. And then eventually I moved into this role doing community education in the Calgary, Alberta area, and also in southern Alberta as a whole. And in that job, I do a lot of presentations for school-age kids. And I was doing a presentation for grade 1 kids. I do a lot of presentations for grade 1 kids because grade 1 kids are learning about the 5 senses. And usually their teachers will bring me in as a person to talk about, you know, they've talked about eyesight, so now I get to talk about what happens when you have no eyesight or poor eyesight. And in those conversations, the subject of guide dogs almost always comes up. And when the subject of guide dogs comes up, the question almost always comes up somewhere in their conversation: why aren't there any guide cats? And so I had a pithy little response that I would give them and say, well, you know, cats get scared pretty easily, right? Yeah. Well, if you're walking along with a guide cat and that cat gets scared and goes up a tree, you're going up that tree with that cat. Oh yeah, was usually the reaction I would get from the little kids. So I took that, I took that story and I went back to the office one day and I was talking to one of my colleagues who I was telling him about the experience and talking to the kids, and he was just killing himself laughing, especially when I got to the part about guide dogs. And he said, have you ever thought of writing a children's book? And I said, no. He said, well, think about it. So I did. I started thinking about it, and I started thinking about other animals that I could have, that a person could have misadventures with. And I wrote Tommy Wants a Guide Dog, about a young boy who has sight loss and a big imagination. And he wants a guide dog, but he's a little too young. So he starts imagining what it would be like to have other animals as guides. That book was released earlier this year and also has an educational component to it, which was really important to me that I put that in there. I wanted to be able to add an educational component talking about guide dog etiquette, and also the CNIB gave me some material on guide dog careers. Because not every dog makes it as a guide dog. Some of them, as they like to phrase it, and I love this, some dogs make different career choices. So there's information in the book about the guide dog etiquette and the guide dog careers. And as a thank you to CNIB, since the release of Tommy Wants a Guide Dog, a portion of the proceeds goes back to CNIB and back to funding the guide dog program, because I could not thank them enough for the help that they've given me. And that book has now sold in 4 different countries. So that is a little bit about, I gave you my backstory. I've talked a little bit about the employment stuff, and I've told you some of the different adventures I've been on. The one thing that I want to leave you with as a result of all of this that I've talked about today is I want you to know that what I've learned from this is literally that life's not over. I was able to do things because of my sight loss that I'd never even dreamed of as a fully sighted person. And I look back on the last 15 years and I think about all of the people I've met, the places I've gone, the things that I've done, and I think, none of that stuff, or very, very little of it, would have happened if I hadn't have lost my sight. And I'm thinking to myself, you know what? Life is good. I really like my life. And you've probably seen my shirt here that says, I'm on this planet for fun. That was a strategy or a philosophy that I adopted many, many years before my sight loss. And losing my sight challenged it. It definitely challenged it. But I think it also helped me get through my sight loss and helped me move forward and helped me push forward. And so when I tell you nowadays that I'm on this planet for fun, that is not just a set of words that I've strung together. It's my lifestyle. And I'm constantly looking for new and different ways to be able to do whatever comes to mind. Back at the beginning of this presentation, I told you about the young boy, the 12-year-old me, who wanted to be in broadcast. Well, I thought that the broadcast dream died when I left VoicePrint. And I thought I had put it to bed and put it to rest. But you know what? I didn't. Back at the end of August of this year, I started a YouTube channel. And on that channel, I'm sharing my experience with cortical visual impairment. I'm sharing what it's like you know, in my experience and the different things that I've gone through. And there'll be different topics that I'm going to share. And you know that I'm going to share about how I'm having fun with it as well. So, you know, as one of my friends once said to me, you can take the boy out of broadcast, but you can't take broadcast out of the boy. Apparently that's true, because it's just the latest adventure that I'm on. And why do I do all of these things? Because as I told you more than once now, I'm on this planet for fun. And I thank you for watching.